everybody for coming out so early in the morning on this. It's going to be a very busy day. I'm going to read some stuff because it's early in the morning. My name is Amy Lakin. I'm president of Working Women's History Project. We are celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. We research, preserve, and promote the stories of historical and current living women with a Chicago connection who worked or are currently working for equality in the areas of labor, women's civil and labor rights. Check out our website at www.wwhpchicago.org and find us on Facebook. So many people and organizations work together to put this program on today, and we'd like to thank our co-sponsors, AAUW Chicago Branch, CAASE, which stands for Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, and SEIU, who provided very valuable tech support. You can get more information about, certainly about CAASE. They have a lot of literature back there and some other information. You can also talk to people whose names and organizations are listed on their name tags if you want more information there. We'd like to thank Brandon, Jennifer, and our own board member, Gwen Long, both of SEIU. We'd like to thank our videographer, Thomas Price. And putting together this program is clearly taking a village, and our board members work tirelessly to make this day happen. So I'd like to recognize our board members. If you would please stand for recognition, because we really appreciate the work you're putting. There's, as people know, there's a lot of events going on today, and a few people have to leave a little earlier because they need to go to the second event. We're extremely privileged to have a very distinguished panel of speakers with us today. I will introduce our interviewer and moderator, who will then introduce the panelists. Our interviewer and moderator is Delmarie Cobb, who began her career as a television reporter and has been a media and political consultant for over 35 years. She has been honored by Indigo, the National Association of Black Journalists, Chicago chapter, and many other organizations. Delmarie is the founder of Ida's Legacy, an organization that develops the next generation of progressive African-American women candidates for public office. And as I said, she'll introduce the other speakers. So with that, I will hand things over to Delmarie.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning. I'm Delmarie Cobb, as you just heard. Thank you for your attendance this morning. A lot is going on today. We've got a No Kings Day protest this afternoon to protect democratic rights, and we're here to discuss another type of protest to protect women's rights and the rights of others who are sexually assaulted, and we want them to be believed. Pagan Kennedy is with us this morning, and she's the author of 12 books. Her writing has appeared in dozens of publications of all genres. She's worked as a columnist and contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. She's co-produced, wrote, and hosted a podcast for the Radiotopia Network that won a 2019 Webby Award for Best Limited Series. She's the recipient of the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship at MIT, an NEA Fellowship, a Smithsonian Science Writing Fellowship, and 2 Mass Cultural Council Fellowships. Today, Pagan joins us to talk about her book, The Secret History of the Rape Kit, a true crime story, which takes us on a journey of discovery about its origins and the role Chicago played in developing this crime-solving tool. Joining the discussion are Saunté Harden-Tate, a community engagement manager at Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, and also the creator of a web-based show, Oh, We Gon' Talk, which facilitates conversations centered around generational trauma within the Black community. She has over 12 years of experience in advocacy and prevention work, which includes advocating for the rights of people such as survivors of domestic and sexual violence, at-risk youth and young adults, holistic trauma-informed care, and the LGBTQ plus community. Next is Dr. Traci Kurtzer. She's a board-certified OBGYN with an expertise in trauma-informed care. She started the first dedicated post-sexual assault medical care clinic in Chicagoland hospitals while an assistant clinical professor and working at Northwestern Medicine from 2019 to 2025. And in 2025, she started Trauma Informed Solutions for Healthcare, LLC, a consulting, training, advocacy firm where she is the medical director. And next is Chenel Vanden Berk, is a forensic nursing specialist. She dedicated her career to forensic nursing for many years and is an actively involved member of the International Association of Forensic Nursing, having served as the Illinois chapter president from 2018 to 2019 and member of its board of directors from 2023 to January 2024. Before nursing, Chenel was an attorney practicing public interest law. I had the privilege of talking to these women earlier this week in preparation for today, and as a former television reporter, it was fascinating to see how knowledgeable, inquisitive, passionate, and caring they are about their work and how to make the system work better for those who need their help. So we're going to start with Pagan. We're going to start with you giving us the history of the rape kit, the Chicago connection, and whether this simple idea has lived up to its full potential. Pagan?
Hi, thank you so much for having me here, and I'm so honored to be here with this amazing panel. We had a pre-meeting where Delmarie had trouble getting us to quiet down because there was so much to talk about. I am going to let you guys know I can just barely hear what's going on. I'm catching about half of it. So I'm just going to, I've been asked to do a 15-minute kind of overview of the history of the Chicago sexual assault forensic system, which became our national system in America. So I'm flying a little bit deaf, I guess, right, not blind, but I can't necessarily hear you if you ask questions or whatever. But so I'm just going to launch into it, but definitely if I'm going over 15 minutes, somebody let me know. I don't want to go on too long. So the story really begins here, and here this picture is of a townhouse in downtown Chicago that was very falling apart in 1972, and it was called, it was the home of a hotline for what was then called runaway teenagers, and this place was called Metro Help. And so yeah, they were fielding calls, which was kind of the height of the hippie movement, so there were all kinds of kids dealing with drug problems and unwanted pregnancy and living on the streets. And so this was the team of folks who were taking the calls and helping out kids on the street. And one thing I want you to just notice is, you know, again, many of you, some of you may have lived through this period, but everything's on paper, as you can see. The phones, I guess they've just gotten push-button phones, but the phones are still very primitive from our point of view. So into this townhouse in downtown Chicago walks Marty Goddard, who in 1972 was a divorcee who was working for a philanthropic organization, and she had been asked to join the board of Metro Help. And so she had come in to do various volunteer shifts, taking calls from these kids who were living on the street. And at the time, you know, when people talked about runaway teenagers, there was sort of the idea that kids were running off to join bands or be in communes or have adventures. But as she took the calls, she was horrified to discover that these kids were running away often from very abusive homes, Often they were the victims of sexual assault, and that is how they had ended up in the street. And so that really changed her view. This is a time at which there was very little understanding of child abuse as we would know it. And, you know, the 13-year-old kids who were being trafficked on the street would be called prostitutes. So it was like a very, very different time. That opened up the question. She began trying to help these girls, in particular the girls who were ending up in juvenile halls and things like that. And her bigger question was, this is clearly an epidemic. How are so many predators getting away with this? Why are there no police investigations of this problem? And so she began really working with this population. And then by 1974, there was kind of a massive awakening in America about sexual assault. There was a very big anti-rape movement that was suddenly happening across the country, and particularly in Chicago. And in 1974, Bernard Carey, who was the state attorney in Cook County, announced that Chicago would launch a task force to look into sexual assault, this massive task force. And because basically he was under there was so much outrage. And the young woman you see there giving the press conference, I did talk to her at length. She's named Cynthia Gary. She worked really closely with Marty Goddard. The reason she's speaking and not Marty Goddard is Marty Goddard was petrified of public speaking. So she had Cynthia do all her talking for her in front of microphones. And they were announcing a new, not just the task force, but also a citizens committee that was going to look into basically failures in policing around sexual assault and evidence collection so this gave Marty Goddard the power to go into the police department, to go into hospitals and crime labs and interview everybody about what was happening on the ground, where were the failure points. And one thing she discovered that was not at all unique to Chicago was that there was a culture in policing where the detective who showed up at or who the accuser reported the sexual assault to, that police officer was considered basically both the judge and the jury before even the evidence was collected, because the thought then was that most women who accused rape, or many of them, were lying, that it was generally not true, that they were making it up. And so you as the police officer, and this is quotes I picked out of a 1973 training manual for police officers that tells them not to believe most of the accusers. So obviously, if you are deciding not to collect it, making a prejudgment on what evidence to collect, you're not getting a lot of evidence. So that was a nationwide problem. And then as she dug into what was going on at a more kind of on the ground level in Chicago, she found that what would happen is, especially when there had been a violent attack, the victim would go into the hospital to get treatment and would report sexual assault there. And the nurses and doctors hadn't been trained in how to collect evidence. And so they would just be treating the victim and then bagging up anything that looked like evidence. But nobody had told them how to collect evidence. So they were sort of simultaneously destroying the evidence without needing to, like ripping up clothes to get at a stab wound or something like that. So they'd put it in a bag, they'd send it to the crime lab, and then the crime lab would open up the bag and say, this is totally useless, and throw it in the trash. So that was pretty much what was happening then. There was no kind of overarching system, and there was very little training for anybody, and very little work to kind of break through the different barriers between the police department, the nurses, and the crime labs, and create a system that united everybody, got everybody on the same page. It was almost like you had to invent a language that everybody spoke together. So that made her begin to think about a kit, and there had been experiments with sexual assault kits, tiny little experiments around the country, so she may have heard of those, I don't know. But she had a much more capacious idea about what would happen, that there would be training, that there would be kits in every hospital, that this would be a system, and that there was so much in the idea that was outside of just the kit itself. It was about training, changing the culture, training people to think scientifically about evidence and to work together. So she was told, so as she's coming up with this idea, she had a friend inside the police department named Rudy Nimitz, and he told her, right, I am pretty sure it was he who told her, advised her on politically how to get this idea going, because as an outsider, her advice would not be appreciated necessarily. So he told her that the person she had to go to in the crime lab was Louis Vitullo. And Vitullo had already been at the head of many successful investigations with the crime lab. So he was Chicago famous, as you might say, and had a lot of power inside the police department. And so she went to him, and the story I was told by Cynthia, who was there more or less, was that Marty went in and talked to him, and he was furious at her for telling him what to do, as he saw it, I guess. But days later, he came around and actually looked at her idea. She may have handed him a design. It's a little hard to know what exactly went on, but took her idea and made a prototype out of it. And so they then worked together on this. But make no doubt about it, she did, my years of research into this shows she did so much work to actually make this happen, including raising all of the money to get the first pilot program started in Chicago in the late 1970s. This is a picture of that original kit. Now this is like a story I don't even have time to go into, but the original funding came from the Playboy Foundation, which was the only Chicago philanthropy organization that was willing to fund this. And you can see this kind of ruby logo on the kit back then, and that, I was told, probably was designed by the art department at Playboy magazine, which is a little weird. But the thing that you kind of notice, if you are familiar with the system as it works today, is just how simple this kit was. And there was a checklist of basically 10 kinds of evidence that the nurse would collect. There were sign-off sheets, and it was very simple what they would collect, and then very clear who had collected it. Everybody would sign off. So there was very, very clear, clean instructions for the medical staff and for the crime lab, and there was like a checklist, and everybody had to sign off on what they had done. So there was accountability as well. And then she also funded all the training for everybody involved in the system, and worked with the hospitals to get this in everywhere. And it was, oh, and I put this slide up just to remind me to give a shout out again to Rudy Nimitz, who's there on the upper right hand. Back when the police, the officers in the police department who handled sexual assault were called homicide sex crimes. And he was really leading that effort. And he was really profoundly helpful to Marty Goddard and helping her navigate not just the ideas around the system, but navigating the politics of it, which were very challenging. And I believe he was probably the one, well, he certainly convinced her that she had to put it bluntly, convince all the men in charge that this had been their idea, and give credit to the police department, to Bernard Carey, and to all the men involved, and make it seem like it had all been sort of their idea. And that probably explains this trademark that Marty Goddard filed originally in 1978, I believe. But she named the kit the Vitullo kit after Louis Vitullo when she filed the trademark. And she did want to give him credit, obviously, but also, you don't need to name evidence kit after anybody, really. I don't know if that's a thing, but I think it was a very smart political move of hers, and she was very much a person who would do whatever she needed to make things happen. This didn't really cost her anything, but it did mean that for the early years of the kit, it was called the Vitullo kit. And then that kind of fell away later. So this was enormously successful immediately. It was clear that this was a great idea. And soon other cities around the country were copying the idea, and it was becoming a national system. And Marty Goddard was very much behind that. She was in the 80s traveling around and advising other cities and kind of working herself into exhaustion, unfortunately. And then by the mid-80s, you have thousands of kits in storage all around the country. And then what makes them much, much more powerful and valuable is that in the 80s, a British scientist made a discovery that led to DNA identification or DNA fingerprinting. So now, when the kit was actually designed, it was in the era pre-computer, rotary phones, police have radios in their cars, and what you can tell from a biological sample, like blood, is very, very limited. You might be, maybe blood type, there are a few other markers, but you can't really narrow down the pool of suspects very much. And so by the time this comes to America in the late 1980s, early 1990s, these kits are suddenly so much more valuable and are being used in trials and really helping to win cases. And also, and then if I have I'm going to very quickly tee up the panel by talking about some of the strong points, the reasons why this system is so powerful and why we need to protect it, because it's very much under threat right now with federal cuts. They're cutting back what is in fact a very expensive system. And so, so one of the most powerful things about this system is that so there's a central database where when there's a positive hit on DNA in a kit, and you do get the DNA, it is sent to the FBI. There's a central database, and that would allow you to connect, if there's a serial predator whose DNA is in several kits, you can now connect those kits, even though if they span many, many states, which often does happen. And so that would allow you to, it really is pretty much a slam dunk if you show that somebody's DNA is in 3 or 4 kits. It's very powerful, and it's a pattern that we wouldn't normally be able to see. That will be completely invisible. I think another underappreciated miracle that the rape kit and DNA identification allows is these kits have so much, if you're looking for a biological sample, these are the place to go. This is often where the biological sample is, that the DNA, where DNA is tested. So in terms of freeing innocent men who've been convicted of sexual assault or robbery or anything else, these kits have been enormously useful. And one reason why false reporting has gone down in recent years, because we have this enormous problem, especially Black and brown men being falsely accused of sexual assault. And when there is DNA, you can settle that question very easily if you do test the kits, which is unfortunately kind of a big if. And then I think one of the things I didn't think about until I really dove deep into this was just the enormous amount you can know about what sexual assault is by looking at the data from thousands of kits when you take them together. So now that we have hits, now that we have data, especially since a lot of kits have recently been processed, because as the backlogs in America have been whittled down, and we're getting a huge amount of data from kits all around the country. And there are really interesting scientists who are studying and looking at the data from those kits and seeing, first of all, that serial rapists, people who are involved in multiple sexual assaults, are much more common than we thought. And unfortunately, the criminal justice system tends to treat sexual assault as kind of a one-off thing. But one thing that's very clear from the data is that, for instance, somebody who's a domestic abuser may be also attacking other people outside the home. Linking together those crimes into a pattern is really powerful. We're seeing that sexual assault is nothing like the Hollywood version. These serial predators, it is not Silence of the Lamb. In general, they're not super geniuses, for the most part, who have some kind of weird tell. They are people who are just picking on the most vulnerable people around them. And these are crimes of opportunity often. And they also may be committing a lot of other crimes as well. And you can just look at the Epstein files to see how these kinds of criminality may be linked together with financial crimes and other scams and things like that. And I'm just going to end on this idea and tee up the panelists maybe to talk about this if they want to. I see that somebody has brought in a modern day kit, which is great. The kit is now approaching its 50th anniversary. So we need to celebrate that and that it's still going. It hasn't, usually when I'm in the room, I will ask audiences what they notice about the difference between the 70s kit and then I have a picture of just a kind of average kit. There's no one kit in America. There's many different ones, but this is kind of just a one kit you might find on hospital shelves, and you can see, I think, first of all, how little it's changed, except for that it's possibly gotten a lot more confusing as committees have stuffed more envelopes into it, which is not necessarily a good thing. But it's still largely all on paper and very little, there are things that have changed around the kit, and we've had all kinds of revolutions in nursing, and which the panelists can talk about. But the kit remains pretty much unchanged, and maybe in some ways that's a good thing, but I think it's something I've been trying to get people to talk about and think about, and what do we need from 21st century sexual assault forensics, and should we add, in new ways of looking at evidence, particularly around digital evidence. So with that, I am going to hand things off to this remarkable panel.
Okay, thank you, Pagan. And so we can make sure that Pagan hears us, I'm going to make sure that we all project while we use the microphones as well. So we're going to start with you to have you briefly describe what you and your organization do as it relates to sexual assault and what Pagan has told us already.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Saunté Harden-Tate. I am the Community Engagement Manager at the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. Sorry, sometimes I'm way too loud, so I'm trying not to blow you all out of the room. So at CAASE, it was founded by Rachel Dunschlack, sorry, I said that wrong sometimes, back in 2006. And so one of the great things about CAASE is that we fill in a lot of gaps for survivors and advocating for their legal rights. It doesn't just involve criminal justice. It involves so many other things that survivors can endure as a survivor. And so we know that as a survivor, it's the most expensive type of victimization for the victim or for the survivor. And so we wanted to make sure that they had access to services legally that they wouldn't normally be able to afford or take care of. So I get to talk about that with survivors. I'm a survivor myself. I'm also a fourth generation survivor. So this is very important to me to talk about this work and let survivors know that there is help for them in the legal system. And navigating that can be very overwhelming. And so I don't take up too much time, I guess, to piggyback off of Pagan's question is, I've had the opportunity to also work as a medical legal advocate, which means that I went into the hospitals when we would hear about a sexual assault happening and support the survivor through the evidence collection kit. So I got to see it firsthand, how they go about collecting everything. We joked about it on the call about one of the most intriguing things I saw at this time was watching the same nurse, or the nurse taking care of that survivor, having to carry this big bag full of evidence around them until the chain of custody could be handed over to the police officer, and they would have it like strapped to their wrist to make sure that nobody touched it. This was important to make sure that nothing was ever said would happen in the chain of custody with the evidence and to preserve it. And so I always thought that was extremely fascinating because they would be quite frustrated sometimes. So who knows, the same nurses that do this work. As far as what the evidence kit could involve to come up to the modern day times, I personally still like the idea that it's paper. I think that with so many things happening with hackers and so much personal information being at risk in technology, I hate the idea of something pertaining to a survivor story being in the wrong person's hands. And so I personally like the archaic system only because I do think it still gives some sort of protection for survivors. And I actually still love the kit as it is. Actually, I think it's very, very thorough. The only thing I wish was more is that the processing of these kids. I think it takes a very, very long time sometimes. They sit for a while. We know the longer that certain evidence sits, the more degraded it becomes, the less opportunity survivors have to actually say this is or link their assault to the offender. So if I could say I would like to see any changes, I think it would just be more expeditious, like viewing of the evidence and processing of the evidence.
First of all, it's just such an incredible experience to be on the panel with these amazing women and honoring Marty. Thank you, Pagan, for your story and bringing her to light. Her path was hard, right? She fought against personal sexism, societal. You talked about victim blaming and denial. And we've come a long way, but I would say we're still contending with those things in this work, for sure. And I guess that's kind of where I come in and why I'm on this panel, is to talk a little bit about my work, which is really focused more on the steps after. Like we're going to focus today on the day in the emergency room and getting the forensic evidence done, but then the patient, the survivor leaves the hospital and what comes next, right? All the care that CAASE does. So I was going to tell a story taking us back kind of into the interval, which is 1993, which is the first time I got paged to the emergency department to perform my first forensic exam for a patient who had been raped. And back then, we would be called as OB/GYN residents if there was a situation like terrible trauma that needed to be addressed for pelvic issues, or if it was a patient that just couldn't tolerate an exam very easily and the nurse was unable to do the work. And again, this is actually pre-SANE. I believe SANEs were really formally trained starting in 1999 in Illinois. So here you are, you have the least experienced, a first-year resident going down to take care of somebody at the most, intense, devastating moment in their life, and with no training. So I will say, yes, there was some training, but there wasn't across-the-board training because it wasn't recognized as being so important, right? Again, these exams are super hard. All respect to Chenel and her colleagues. And they take a lot of time, and certainly that was, a commodity for residents working 120-hour work weeks back then. So most of my colleagues, when they got that page, it was like the dreaded page to the emergency room. They hated that, and I would often volunteer for them, like, you cover labor and delivery, and for me, I'll go down and take care of that patient because, one, I cared, but I also found as an introvert, maybe a little neurodivergent, it really pushed me in a challenging way to take care of patients who really needed really good care at that moment. And so I would do those exams and do them over and over again. And what I learned from that were skills that weren't super common back then. And I then graduated, applied that into my 15 years of private practice. And in 2015, I was hired and recruited to join Northwestern. And for the first time, I was actually kind of put up in a comparison to my peers, right? So it's the first time, I'd been a solo doc my whole life until then, but for the first time I was getting scores, peer scores, how do you compare to your colleagues in the office? How do you compare to your colleagues in the department? How do you compare to all specialists? And consistently I was getting, highest patient satisfaction, Press-Ganey scores, not one-offs, but month to month, quarter to quarter. And it wasn't until 2016 when I first read the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration Principles of Trauma-Informed Care that I had an aha moment, right? Creating patient safety, both emotional and physical safety. Yep, I learned that back in the emergency room. How do you convey transparency and trustworthiness? Check. Learned that back then during those exams, and I just was continuing this work through. mutuality, collaboration with the patient, providing patient voice and choice, right? That sense of control over their situation, cultural humility and peer support. These are all the principles that when medical professionals engage in that, we take better care of our patients, and quite honestly, we take better care of ourselves and our colleagues too. And so I've really been, basically that acknowledgement that that's what was happening, and having kind of the benefit of these like very positive scores behind me was really what led me into being recruited to come downtown at Northwestern. And at that point I became the clinical assistant professor and medical director of trauma-informed care and education. So I was able to start doing training to medical students and other trainees and my colleagues and same nurses about really like intentionally applying some of these principles. And then that led to me also starting the first clinic for post-sexual assault care. And that's kind of the culmination. I just wanted to tell a little bit of that background, but it really was a patient interaction that led me to start the clinic. And I will show that story because it's not as triggering as the ER story, which was a patient who I'd been seeing for years, and she came in for her annual, pap smear family exam. And she nonchalantly asked if she could get an HIV test. And so, as a happily married woman, I kind of did my usual, I'm happy to do that. Is there something going on? Some concerns about like fidelity, that I might need to do any other testing for you? And she opened up that she had been raped 6 months before and had gone for subsequent care with, check-in visits that we do and testing after at outside clinics, just places that she just made an appointment, had no connection to them whatsoever. And I said to her, why did you not come to see me for your follow-up care? I would have been happy to take care of you for that. And she said, Dr. Kurtzer, you care so much for your patients, and I didn't want an experience that literally broke me to cause pain for you too.
Wow.
So what that really is like another light bulb moment for me is patients, and we know the stats now, 30% of patients who are seen in the emergency room, survivors, do not get their follow-up care. Whether that's because, they're worried about being blamed or being judged or vicarious trauma in that case. The reality is, I realize you need to have a site, a place where patients, whether they are assigned to a primary care and have a connection with a physician, or they don't or they do, they need a place where they know they can get that follow-up care with somebody who is trauma-informed and trained and knows what to do. And so much I learned from doing that clinic, and that's where I am right now, is in my role is I'm really, in any opportunity like this today, trying to really promote this concept of having specialized, dedicated care for these survivors, because otherwise they get lost in the system. I'm happy to talk more about trauma-informed care principles or what we learned from the clinic. But as far as the question about the testing, I agree. I really do believe there's some benefit to still, even though it was hard back then, I was already a doctor, not able to write very legibly, but I do feel like there's a benefit to having the handwritten report and the way the system is in place right now. I would say for maybe preservation of evidence, continuing to advance science on ways to keep the evidence preserved better, and just continuing to advance the science on getting more evidence too.
Thank you. Hi, I'm going to do things a little bit, this is probably not the best idea, but when I was doing some preparation with this wonderful panel here, including Pagan, she had mentioned something that doing this work kind of didn't occur to me, but how almost mysterious the sexual assault kit is. So I I'd like to pass this around. This is an actual kit. It's just been decommissioned for training purposes. But I asked you to open it up, take a look at it, really go through it while I'm talking, if that's okay, just so that you can kind of get an idea. And Pagan had mentioned that the kit was a way to kind of create this language on how to respond to sexual assault. And it truly is that today too. It's sort of a Rosetta Stone. It is a way for many of us who do this work to communicate with each other. You know, we talk about advocates. We use this kit to, the advocates use it to educate each other about what a patient can expect when they go through the hospital. In my work as a sexual assault nurse, you'll see in the kit itself, there's a medical forensic chart. We talk about, you know, how a lot of the stuff is handwritten. It helps us know what kind of questions to ask the survivor, and it communicates, it's a way for us to communicate with the survivor. You know, what kind of information do we need to know to help us understand what kind of evidence to collect, and also what kind of care to provide. And Dr. Kurtzer actually made a very interesting point. A lot of us sexual assault nurses get into this work because no one else wanted to do that, even to this day. And I think the reason is there's still a lot of stigma, a lot of shame around sexual assault. And oftentimes I think it's a lack of understanding, right? We know that fear is about not understanding something. And again, in preparation, we were talking about law enforcement, and it used to be really law enforcement handled it, right? But they didn't necessarily get the training. And even to this day, I would go out and do some, you know, roll calls or training with law enforcement, and we would start bringing the kit along. And it was amazing. Like, we just said, wait, how many of you guys even know what's in a kit? Just like, no. And so we understood, well, wait a minute, let's pass this around. Let's give them an opportunity to understand what's in there. Why is this so important to bother with, to pick it up? What are we even doing? And I know a lot of officers would give feedback to say, well, wait a minute. And, you know, there's still like sort of the hurdle about believing. And I think it's that difficulty understanding that another human being could do that to someone else. That's where the disbelief comes in. I don't necessarily, I'd like to believe it as that, oh, you're a liar, but rather my brain can't comprehend that someone could do this to another human being, so I just won't even deal with it. But what the kit did was it helped people understand that someone is putting themselves through this invasive procedure. There's all of these things within the kit itself that a survivor has to do, you know, if they want to avail themselves to justice. So again, it's a way to communicate to law enforcement, this is important to someone. This is really something that they're willing to do. But it also communicates that trauma-informed care piece. It's not just about collecting the evidence. If you guys look, it's nothing magical, but really it's how you collect that evidence. What kind of care are you showing? How are you treating this person? And then it's also a way for us to communicate with the crime lab. We never talk to the crime lab. Oftentimes we don't even know, many of the people who collect the evidence or participate in that, like physicians, advocates, we might not know what the results are. We don't pick up a phone and say, hey, crime lab, we've got this kind of evidence, we've collected this and that, these are the injuries that we've observed, but rather we put all that information, we write it down, we put it in the kit, we seal it up, and then we communicate in a way that the crime lab should be able to open it up and say, this is what happened, this is what was observed, this is what was seen. And it's then the crime lab communicates back to the prosecutors, this is what we found. So it's really this sort of amazing thing in a way. You know, you've seen those movies where they open up this magical case. That's what the kit is like. And if there's any changes, I will say what's nice about it is it's constantly evolving. And I wouldn't necessarily say what's in the kit that's important, but rather the training around it. And being able to open up that language. Right before this, I worked at the International Association of Forensic Nurses, which is a national organization to provide training for sexual assault nurses and forensic nurses. And I got to understand how different states work. Many states aren't as, well, that came out wrong, but Illinois is awesome, I will just say, because we have a standardized kit. And many other states don't have that. Like certain states, different counties are actually responsible for the structure of the kit, who pays for the kit, how it's put together. And I will say, in Illinois, a sexual assault survivor, and it's supposed to be nationally, but they do not pay for this. They should not pay whatsoever for this. And also, as part of that, what Dr. Kurtzer was saying, it's not just about the evidence as well, but it allows a patient to come see us, a survivor, and say, hey, I might need some help. Marty, I don't want to spoil alerts if you haven't read the book, but she also had a sexually transmitted infection as a result of this. So there's impacts that go way beyond just physical injuries at the moment. And I will say, I will finish off with this, is sexual assault doesn't just impact the individual. It really hurts the community. And this kit shows us how far and how many lives this actually touches and how we need to stand together. Really, all the different components come together to make one successful response to sexual assault.
One of the things you mentioned is cost. And in the book, it talked about a kit being $1,000 per kit. But that took into account the training and everything else. So the fact that Marty did such a comprehensive job of understanding that it wasn't just putting a kit together, you had to have all the ecological surroundings to make it work. And so given that, if that was what it cost then, how does that impact what we see now in terms of cost? I mean, is the cost still prohibitive? And who is impacted by that? Any of them?
It's still expensive, but it shouldn't be expensive for the survivor. When a survivor goes into the hospital to receive care, including the kit, their stay at the hospital, their visit should be absolutely free of charge. They also should be provided with post-care vouchers. Those post-care vouchers should allow for them to continue to get follow-up care. Unfortunately, a lot of survivors don't utilize those vouchers, but they should be able to take that voucher and get whatever services, testing, and any other medication, etc., that they needed. And one of the great things about the kit is part of the examination includes testing, but a lot of times those results won't show up immediately after the assault. It takes time for the infection to show up in any testing that you may do. So we always encourage to come back and continue that. We also administer medication, which we know can be extremely expensive. So the survivors do have the option to decline medication, but we always encourage it so that that prophylactic medication can try and prohibit any infections from taking hold within the body. But it's still very expensive, not just for the medical kit, but time off work, mental health needs. It goes on. The legal support, all of those things, etc., still is a lot, and usually that is incurred by the state through funding, through grants, through donations. That's why it's super important to be involved if you can, just to donate, to vote for folks that understand the power and importance of supporting survivors. So this is absolutely still a very expensive thing, and it should not be up to the survivor to take care of that.
And I would just add to that, I was going to say definitely, the state of Illinois and our state does cover that, but a lot of that is through grant funding that is decided, at the national level. I would say the kit is having it covered by the state or federal government, and if it ever became nationalized, is so critical because, again, that's part of the trauma-informed care piece, right? It's telling that survivor that we as a society do not hold you responsible in any way, shape, or form for what just happened to you. You had nothing, you had no blame in that. And that's why we as a society, recognizing we have this tragedy that happens, happens way too much, we cover the costs of your care, including up to 6 months after.
And I want to add too that it's the responsibility of the hospital to purchase those kits. And there is a tracking system, I hadn't mentioned it, but they're now, rather recently, they've developed a tracking system where we enter the kit once it's done and it's sealed, and the survivor gets like a PIN number. So they can follow it as well. They don't know what the results would be, but they know where it is. And the idea is, again, so that it's not sitting on a shelf somewhere, that it hasn't been picked up from the hospital. And then the kits themselves are also tracked by the state, so they know at any one given time how many kits are at a certain hospital. And there have been shortages. You know, you mentioned cost and things like that. The hospitals aren't paying, like they don't make a profit from this. It isn't quite the same. So it's really hard to determine how many do we have on the shelf. And I will say, Illinois has updated the kit recently. They have made some different changes, and then they've involved a lot of different disciplines in doing that as well. But it isn't the most cost attractive thing to do to provide care. And so the hospitals that are supporting forensic nursing, it's not that they aren't getting these patients, it's just how much are they able and willing to invest in making sure that these patients who aren't necessarily profitable are getting that care. And to your credit and point about voting, there's frustration with the kits being processed or being picked up. And I've been practicing as a forensic nurse for a decade, and I've seen the changes because staffing impacts that. Not just nursing shortages, but also budgets, crime lab. We're asking a lot of them to process these things, and it's just funny because I learned a lot from TV. And once I started practicing, it's like, wait a minute, no. When I started, there was a lot of special victims units in each of the police departments. Well, nowadays, I don't think there are many that actually have a dedicated staff that's just able to focus on that. In Chicago, the police department have maybe 1 or 2 evidence technicians, and they're the ones that they send out to collect a kit. So it really, talk about trickling down, the impacts of lack of funding or diversion of funding to what seems to be valued changes the ability to really treat survivors on a direct level.
Following up on that, and voting and political, everything is political. Given that this administration has cut back on funding for violence against women, I would imagine that that's had some impact on this area. So can you speak about that? What have you seen in terms of the impact on it based on the administration cutting back funds?
Okay, well, I will say, again, I worked at a national organization, and our funding was 80% grant funding from the Department of Justice. Recently, those grants were cut to the point where our organization disintegrated, literally disintegrated. An organization that provided training, education, resources, technical support, where we would go and help train organizations to train other SANEs. We weren't able to sustain ourselves without that grant funding. And I also worked on a tribal grant for Native Americans who also received a lot of government funding. That was impacted as well, so we saw a lot of tribal organizations that specifically dedicated themselves to supporting survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. And so it's a little bit disheartening and confusing to hear that there is a focus on crime and responding to crime. And then, what is that saying? It's like, how do I trust what you say when I see what you're doing? I think it's Baldwin. But yeah, and so it's kind of that impact. But I will say, whenever I get that moment where I feel disheartened or a little bit like, why are we even doing this? I meet these wonderful women like Pagan, or even people, individuals, like I said, and the women on this panel, and just even you all for being here. It just gives me that little like, no, the work's going to continue. We'll just figure out how to do it. And again, we can't do it alone, but we can find a way together to do that. And Marty's story, oh my gosh, this woman had been through so much, and she didn't do it for the glory or the glamour. She just did it because she had a passion for it. She couldn't, she couldn't stop. And I feel very much if you care about people, if you care about individuals, you find it.
I'll just add to that. Earlier you talked about why a lot of us do this work. I do this work because I am a 4th generation survivor, and I want to be the person that I needed when I experienced sexual harm. And so with that in mind, sometimes it's difficult being a survivor, supporting survivors. I joke with my director friend, Anika Sterling-Flores, all the time. I'm always like, yeah, I think I need a break from this because it is overwhelming, but I always find my way back to doing this work because it is absolutely important. I have a forensic psychology background. I actually was going to go in and interview serial sex offenders as a way of trying to figure out how to stop sexual harm, but finding out that they have the highest recidivism rates, they always reoffend. I knew that my best place was to help survivors and support survivors, which led me to do this work. As far as how government funding affects that, sexual violence is still very taboo. It's still very stigmatized. It's still very victim blame centered. Rape culture is absolutely real. And so when they think about ways to take money away, the first thing that they think to do is to stop supporting survivors. And that has to stop. To your point about crime, this is crime. And it is something that's happening a lot more than we can measure. A lot of survivors do not report. There's 1 in 4 African American survivors. I always lead with saying, the next time that you're at Thanksgiving dinner, just know 1 in 4 of the women in that room are survivors, whether you are aware or not. It's that prevalent. So we cannot stop. We must vote. We must come to things like this. We must support in any way we can. We must educate. I've been a community educator. As a community engagement manager, one of the things we do is we educate. It's super important for people to understand what that violence looks like, how it affects everyone in the community, everyone around that survivor, and we cannot stop.
So I'm not going to talk much about government funding, other kind of pivoting this a little bit in a public health approach and kind of preventatives, kind of to what you're alluding to, right? Could we intervene with maybe the offenders? That may or may not be successful, but we can definitely engage in good care with survivors afterwards and make sure that they are cared for. And what the data shows, unfortunately, is that a survivor of sexual assault as an adult is 8 times more likely to have a repeat sexual assault as compared to somebody who's not been assaulted before. So there's a myriad of theories as to why that is the case. But what I can tell you from running the clinic that I did is that every single one of those theories is addressed by having specialist care, dedicated care for those survivors. And we need to obviously to take care of the medical aspect, right? The infections and making sure treatment's been done, and traumatic brain injuries, such a high rate of those in sexual assault survivors as well as domestic violence survivors. That those conditions need to be identified and treated. But what I would say is, a couple big things that came out that needed addressing in their care. And one of the things that the stats that I came out of from tracking my clinic was that about 25% of the survivors that I cared for had vulnerability factors that would potentially predispose them to later violence. So that could be social drivers of health, unstable housing, even food insecurity, certainly like toxic abusive relationships. if those patients left the emergency room, and oftentimes that's not a great environment for really having an opportunity to open up, right? That you guys establish rapport so quickly that it takes sometimes time and repeated visits with somebody to really get that connection and trust developed. And that's oftentimes where some of these, and through screening, some of these other conditions came to light, that there was an opportunity there for intervention. And if we intervene in some of those drivers for later violence, we can cut down on the number of victims in the future too. And so that's another approach, I think, to addressing kind of the economics of this. If you're really just looking at the number crunching and cost of care is something that those survivors are going to have provided through their follow-up 6-month visit, but we need to get them opportunities to get that care and make it accessible to them.
One of the things that we you had mentioned the trauma-informed piece and why that was kind of so important. I think doing this work, I take it for granted, but being a provider who, do you mind, is it okay if she explains a little bit about what trauma-informed is and why is that different? I know, again, in the book, one of the things at the end is Marty wasn't receiving care. She had been sexually assaulted and she just didn't want to go to a doctor. And many of you guys, how many people have been to the emergency room and let's say you just had a sore throat or something, and you can think about how you were treated. Just thinking maybe I've got strep throat. The wait times and things like that. And so we throw around this term. I think we're so used to using trauma-informed care. Do you mind? I just want to highlight how awesome Dr. Kurtzer is and why this is such an important approach to the medical care as well as tying it into survivors.
Love to. Those are things yes, so I would say, I mentioned those principles before, but what does that look like practically? And these are, when we do these trainings, that's like an hour training, so I won't go into all of it, but in an outpatient setting, but even in an emergency room setting, it can be things from how furniture is arranged in the room, and all of staff being trained, so you're not having breaks in the system where somebody has a bad experience or a judgmental experience with somebody. But again, providing that emotional and physical safety for somebody, and really, I often would use the term we're a team in this together, right? It's kind of that mutual respect for each other, and seeing really somebody holistically, the full picture, right? You are not just a victim. You're not just that one thing that happened to you. I see the totality of you. I see that you're the grandmother taking, care of children and, or doing, amazing work or surviving domestic violence and having the courage to come into my office, to get your follow-up care. So trauma-informed care is, really, a lot of that, and then on the really nitty-gritty with the medical is absolutely the consent. It's the consent, education and consent. Everything has to be in the survivor's control. So anything I do, from the littlest bit of an exam, certainly to any testing, is a decision that, and I'm a gynecologist, so I'm going to say she, because I take care of women primarily, but it's a decision that the survivor needs to make about their care and what they want. So that's a big thing. The other big part is peer support, and normalization, and I don't want to say normalization of sexual assault. That should never be normalized, but it's normalization that you're not alone, that this, happens. Again, it's kind of that reverse victim blaming. This happens to people so much, and that just shows you how it's a societal problem. It's not a you problem. But that was another theme that came out in the clinic that I took care of when I would see patients at their 2-week, 6-week, 3-month visit, is every single time they needed a lot of reinforcement that you are not to blame for this. They needed a lot of reinforcement to get follow-up, therapy care if they chose to go that route. But I certainly encouraged it, and then the other thing was just that immediate, that acute issues with sleep disturbances. PTSD is so high, it's actually, I think, reportedly higher than combat veterans from sexual assault. So if those folks, maybe Marty, I would say from reading the story, I suspect she had some PTSD. And if that's somebody who's then expected to go out and function and go to work and take care of other people, and they're not getting care for that or getting it recognized, that's going to affect them. And again, it affects all of us, right? That's a problem, a community problem, a societal problem.
So we have about 10 more minutes left, and we want to make sure that we open it up to the audience if you have any questions. There's someone back there.
Hi, I'm wondering if that's...
1 second.
Raise your hand. Thank you. I'm just wondering if any of you saw the recent episode of The Pit, where a nurse in the emergency room went through the administration of the kit step by step.
Use the mic. I'm sorry.
A nurse went through, in this television program, an ER nurse went through the administration of the kit step by step. And I just wondered if any of you saw it and could comment on its accuracy. At the end of that, she went to put the kid in the thing for the police to pick it up, and one from 2 weeks ago was still there. So I'm wondering if that handoff, that chain of control and handoff, if that happens a lot.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. That episode came.
Excuse me, could you hear, I'm sorry, Chenel.
Oh,
Pagan, could you hear the question?
Pagan, were you able to hear the question?
I think you were talking about The Pit.
Yes, there was an episode, and I think she wanted to know
I
about
caught that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that episode. Everybody, actually, all my friends
Yeah.
were emailing me the next day saying, did you see The Pit? And I think you guys can probably talk to that better than I can. But yeah, certainly that. One thing maybe you guys on the panel can speak to is there's that problem. It seems like, in my research, another big problem, probably what I would call the biggest problem, it seems like, is that I think if you asked an average person how this system functions, they would just assume that it's a basic human right, that if you're sexually assaulted, you could go into any hospital and receive both treatment and report, have your evidence filed, and have that done, that very important forensic exam done. That is not the case. We have just such enormous gaps in our care. I've seen the figure that only 20% of hospitals have a sane nurse available in the full, and again, you on the panel can speak to this. The problem is so bad that we haven't even mapped the problem in most states, so we don't even know where you can't get care. In Canada, there's a group called She Matters that's mapping all the gaps in care, and they found that 40% of the population, often mostly people who live on native lands, have no access. Like really, they would have to drive 6 hours or something to get care. And they might even not, what She Matters has done is at least mapped out where you can get care, so that would save you, I guess, from driving to the hospitals where you would be turned away. But to my mind, I was sort of surprised that they didn't address this at the Pit. I was like, well, it's kind of amazing they actually have a sane nurse there. And, so I was a little disappointed that they didn't address that problem.
I will say that the advisor on that episode was one of the pioneers of forensic nursing. She was an established forensic nurse who did that, and so it was very accurate. And up until recently, hospitals were responsible for storage of the kits. There's an Illinois law, it's one of the few states that actually has a law that codifies the sexual assault response, and in that law, it says that law enforcement is supposed to pick up the kit within a certain amount of time. If that isn't, then there are ways to make sure that you address that. So there were instances where they would be in there for weeks because law enforcement wasn't able to pick it up or whatever, they just didn't pick it up. Right, and we used to have them, like we would store them. And part of a survivor, they can choose not to test the kit right away. So we can collect it and there's a status to hold it. But now that's changed, and so they have to pick it up. And we have safes in most hospitals so that you no longer have to worry about the like literally attaching it to your body. You can store it in a locked safe.
And one of the great things I do appreciate about the state of Illinois is that they're required to call you an advocate out. By law, an advocate must be called out for you to the hospital. You have the right to the collection of evidence. And so while there's some states that do not have that law, Illinois does protect survivors in that way, and I do appreciate that.
There's another question.
Right here, here's the card.
How could a hospital not have the information and deal with patients? The comment that the video said, you know, that 40% hospitals don't even, how could that be?
Funding, lack of acknowledgement that this is an important human right for survivors. Again, sexual assault, sexual violence is still so very stigmatized and taboo. We still don't address it, we don't talk about it. We've made strides, but it's still not being addressed the way that it needs to. When we talk about funding cuts, it's often one of the first things on the shopping block, is violence against women especially. So people prioritize other things, unfortunately, which is why it's important to speak out against that.
I would like to add that it's one-to-one care. So that's what makes it a little bit different too, is so for staffing, you know, like, okay, how many nurses does it take for how many patients? When a sexual assault survivor comes in, it really is one nurse to that one patient, and they have to stay with that patient throughout. And so in an average, like ER, they do all these calculations about how many nurses, the patient ratio, and so they crunch the numbers, and so it isn't necessarily like a cold pardon type thing. I mean, it is, but so that's one of the reasons I think it's difficult, because we used to see one of the busiest programs in the state, and that would be like we have a couple hundred a year, right? But to an emergency department, that's nothing. You know, those numbers, like they see that in a couple of hours. So to try to justify making that expenditure for staffing, and SANEs are trained. I didn't really have time to mention that, but we are nurses, but there's a whole lot of training that goes into it. It isn't just take a class and then get signed off or take a test. There is a preceptor component, there's a lot of hands-on, there's interaction with community. So there is several hours of training that a hospital also has to pay for. So those are all numbers that they have to consider as well.
I'm just going to add that, you know, men are part of the equation too, right? The funding often comes from sources like the Violence Against Women Act, but guess what? It takes care of male survivors as well. And so as men supporting their brothers and women supporting their brothers out there, like that needs to be part of the discussion. This is funding that helps everybody, right?
I know that it's reported that a lot of sexual assault occurs in retirement homes or nursing homes. Now, is that handled within that facility, or the police ever called in?
Yes.
So yeah, actually, when there are sexual assault nurses, we are also trained on elders, all ages, really, and it's one kit for all ages. So there isn't like a special child's kit or anything like that. And so that's why it's important to also have the training on how you are treating the patients, because as you can imagine, anatomy might be a little different in terms of how you can collect and, you know, the gynecologists over here would help attest to that, but there's different considerations, but also history taking, because one of the things that SANE does is we ask what happened, how it happened, and so if people especially are, you know, recounting things that happened within a facility, then you also have to know the reporting structure as well. So there is a neutrality. That's the idea behind having it taken away from law enforcement and it's not taken away, but rather handled in a medical setting, is that idea of the neutrality of it.
I just want to add that, yes, that individual would be transported to the hospital.
For their care, we don't have traveling same nurses that go out, but that brings up another point, which is, in addition, federally qualified healthcare centers are allowed to do forensic exams, but ambulatory offices are not. Mike isn't working.
It died.
But ambulatory offices are not, like outpatient offices, we do not do the forensic exam. So you do need to have, it is set for, particular areas where that is allowable for evidence to be collected. And maybe one, thing to consider would be, with advanced funding, would there be opportunities maybe that would accelerate the number of individuals in nursing homes that are maybe more immobilized or it's harder for them to get out, or in care facilities where they're really incapacitated? Maybe there needs to be, a dream would be allowing to have traveling, kind of like, house docs used to go around taking care of people, that have a team that would do that. And then think about that for the patients that just are so fearful of coming into a hospital, right? We know there's a subset of patients that will not step into a hospital for whatever fears they have, justified or not. That wouldn't it be nice if we had opportunities to still take care of them and have evidence collection available to them?
I just have one quick question as well, and that is there a difference in terms of race, in terms of how you collect evidence for Black women and white women and other women?
I think that's a really great question, and I do appreciate that Pagan addressed, how Marty advocated for that as well. And the kit itself is pretty standardized, but there are definitely different considerations. I had talked about how originally in the kit, I don't know if you have a chance to see it, but there's an envelope for hair combing, which has your standard picture day hair comb, and then there is a envelope for pubic hair, things like that. Well, different ethnicities, especially women of color, men of color, the hair texture is going to be different. So that kind of comb is not going to be something that's effective to collect those kind of combings. So the idea behind it in the national protocol states that we can adapt to the individual. And Dr. Kurtzer had mentioned patient-centered care, same with the advocates. The idea is who's in front of you? How can we take these tools and adapt them to the person? Photography, we didn't talk about that, but that is also considered part of the sexual assault exam. We take it for evidence. We identify, measure, document any injuries that we might see. And we know that oftentimes the way you take a picture might not show the bruising on darker skin or melanated skin. So as part of the training, we're training people to really use all of your skills. Don't just look over a bruise because you don't necessarily see it. Ask about pain, touch after you collect evidence. And now they've updated the kit. There's no longer that standard comb. Now they're using more swabs. So that's something that, again, it could be used for any type of hair texture, but also consideration about culture. I've done work, again, with Native Americans, and there's also that cultural component. I'll never forget, I was at a tabling event, this was like last year, and she had asked a sexual assault coordinator to ask if we could come out and talk to her SANE nurses, and because she said that they didn't think they needed training about cultural sensitivity because, quote, oh, we deal with immigrants all the time. And my brain went, whoa! But yeah, so even the fact that you have to consider it, just ask yourself that question is very, is part of that training as well.
And darker skin, it is harder sometimes to see the trauma and bruises, and that's where I think having more standardized, use our technology. We have technology with the lamps and the equipment that we can use that picks up injuries, but they're not readily available to all ERs or systems. Again, so this is where having, a priority to make sure that everybody has the same access to care, on a national level too.
One more question.
I did have a question, but I think your time is up.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Amy, were you going to close out?
Well, I guess I can. As I said earlier on, oh, thank you. Oh.
It's on.
Oh, okay.
All you have to do is talk.
Oh, okay. Earlier on, really appreciate you coming up.
It's not on.
It's not
Oh,
on.
it's not on.
It's tricky.
Oh, I may have hit the button. I may have hit the button inadvertently. Anyhow, as I said earlier, we really appreciate people showing up and coming out on a day like today. There are lots of events going on, as people are well aware. And really want to thank this distinguished group of women who shared their knowledge and experiences. Pagan, we're so happy we were able to get you up on the screen. We would love to have you here in person, but
It's amazing, and I'm so glad to be in touch with the panelists, and I'm sure we're going to continue the conversation.
it's certainly worth continuing, and our distinguished panel who are here in Chicago, and of course our moderator Delmarie Cobb, Saunté Harden-Tate, Traci Kurtzer, and Chenel Vanden Berk. Really glad to hear from you. Again, check us out, www.wwhpchicago.org, and find us on Facebook, and also check out the information that Saunté has brought about CAASE back there. Okay, I don't think I have anything else to say, so